If you mean to marry me out of pity, then I refuse." The words cut sharp as a blade, ringing out in the blistering noon of Red Creek, halting every curious stare and every scornful whisper swirling like the red dust across the main street. Lydia Harper, the black woman who had just stepped down from the wagon, did not bow her head, did not tremble. Her prairie green dress stirred in the wind, and her steady brown eyes swept through the crowd with quiet defiance. Across from her stood Jonas Hale, a hard man long known for his silence, now carrying the heavy promise he had made to a fallen friend. In the thickened air, he gave a single nod. Slow, certain, a nod that rewrote the fate of them both beneath the taut gaze of the town. From that instant, Red Creek witnessed not just a marriage, but the spark of a story that would echo for years to come. Yet was it to be true love, or only the chains of a vow forged in a snowstorm? Red Creek, Montana. Noon, spring of 1879. The sun stood high, burning down on the main street of the small frontier town. Red dust rose from wagon ruts, from horses' hooves, from boots dragged day after day, hanging in the air like a thin veil of smoke. No one in Red Creek paid much mind to the dust anymore. It had become part of the place itself, clinging to the wooden walls, to hems of coats, and to every tale whispered on the saloon porch. But today, the dust made hearts uneasy. It meant a wagon was coming. From early morning, the news had spread like fire through dry brush. Jonas Hale, foreman of the Hale Ranch, was set to meet the betrothed of Matthew Kincaid, the friend who had perished only weeks before in the snowstorm. A woman was said to be on her way. Her name was Lydia Harper. That was all anyone knew, except that she had come because of a promise. So the whole of Red Creek turned out on Main Street. The blacksmith laid down his hammer, sweat still streaking his brow. The baker's wife stepped out, flour dusting her apron. Children crowded the porch railings, giggling, though their eyes were wide with expectation. Even the elders made their way with canes, shuffling through the throng, just to stand and watch. Some came out of curiosity, some to mock, and others merely for the promise of fresh gossip on long evenings. The main street of Red Creek became a stage, every eye fixed on the blur of dust rising in the east. The creak of wagon wheels broke the silence, followed by the sharp crack of a whip. A four-wheeled coach rolled into sight, the horses lathered with sweat, their chests heaving. The driver hunched forward, face cracked and weathered by sun and wind. When the coach pulled up before Murphy's General Store, dust billowed, then settled into a thick haze of anticipation. Jonas Hale was already there. He stood by the hitching post, tall and broad-shouldered, his coat worn pale by sun and years of labor. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow that hid much of his weathered face. Folks said Jonas was a man of few words, a man who held himself apart like a stone planted on the open prairie, always there, yet never fully known. Today, all eyes waited to see how that man would act. The coach door swung open. The first to step down was a peddler, muttering about the ruts in the road while dusting his plaid jacket. A weary woman followed, clutching a baby to her hip. The crowd murmured, "Not her, not her." Then came a hand, slender, gloved in pale brown, gripping the frame of the coach. A dark blue-green skirt followed, falling in careful pleats. Slowly, a figure emerged, descending the steps. Lydia Harper. The instant her boots touched the ground, the street seemed to stop breathing. Her dress was plain, unadorned by lace or trim. Her stride was steady, her chin lifted, each step unhurried yet firm. Thick black hair was pinned neatly beneath a round hat, framing a face composed, serene. Brown eyes swept the crowd, meeting, gaze after gaze without faltering, without lowering. But her skin was dark, and that alone set the whispers aflame. A colored woman. Lord above, this is what Kincaid left us? Clinging to him, no doubt. The murmurs spread quick as fire, twisting faces into sneers, furrowed brows, startled stares. Mothers pulled children close, men folded their arms, watching hard. For many, Lydia's presence was a challenge, an unspoken affront. A black woman stepping from a wagon into the heart of Red Creek, claiming to be the fiancée of one of its white sons. Still, she walked on, unbothered by the stares, untouched by the barbs. Her face stayed calm, her steps sure, each one a quiet defiance against pity. From beneath the brim of his hat, Jonas lifted his eyes. Gray met brown, a steady gaze, unflinching. In hers, he saw something rare. Not arrogance, not fragility, but a calm strength he could not name. The crowd hushed all at once, as though the air itself demanded silence. The whispers died. Only the wind stirring the porches and the restless pawing of horses filled the pause. Lydia moved closer. The space between her and Jonas closed until only a stride or two remained. No one dared step between them, as though they all bore witness to some strange rite only those two understood. She stopped, straight-backed, chin high, eyes forward. The wind caught the hem of her dress, tugging it gently as she stood before him. "If you mean to marry me out of pity, then right here I refuse." The words fell sharp, clear, steady, like the tip of a knife pressed into the dusty ground. Not shouted, not shrill, yet strong enough to choke off every whisper that had only just begun to stir. For a heartbeat, Red Creek froze in place. The whole of Main Street went silent. Horses tied nearby tossed their heads, tugging at the reins, manes flying as though startled by the sudden emptiness of sound. Children on the porches bit down on their fingers. Grown folk leaned forward, straining not to miss a word. Some mouths hung open. Some eyes darted about, waiting for the answer. This was not the way of Red Creek. Here, men were the ones to speak, women the ones to stay silent behind them. Yet now, in the blaze of noon, a woman barely set foot in town stood before all, declaring her terms, not a plea, but a refusal laid bare. Every gaze swung to Jonas Hale. He stood unmoving, his broad shoulders half in shadow, the brim of his hat throwing darkness across his eyes. To most, Jonas was a hard man, unreadable, a figure of silence. But today, they hungered to see what he would do. Jonas raised his head, his gray eyes locked on Lydia's brown. In them he found no begging, no weakness, only something else entirely. A calm that carried a challenge. It reminded him of standing before cattle gone wild in a snowstorm. You could not show fear, for if you faltered, the whole herd would break loose. That was how Lydia stood before him now, not needing rescue, but demanding proof of who he was. The crowd stayed hushed. A man coughed, trying to crack the tension, but no one laughed. A woman whispered to her husband, "Did she truly say that?" A young fellow muttered, "Well, this just got interesting." But none dared interrupt. Jonas held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded. One nod, slow, firm, without flourish, yet all saw it, and it thickened the silence even more. Something shifted inside Jonas. He had thought this only duty, a debt owed Matthew. But when Lydia spoke, he knew this was not charity. She did not want it. What she wanted was the truth, whether he would stand with her as an equal. His nod, though simple, carried the weight of an unspoken vow. Lydia breathed out, barely more than a sigh. So slight it could be mistaken for nothing but the rustle of cloth. But Jonas caught it, and when she dipped her head, the motion small as adjusting her skirt, he knew it for what it was. Her acceptance, not from weakness, but as one who met him eye to eye. The spell broke, and murmurs swelled again. He nodded, in front of everyone. Lord help us, then it's real? Red Creek won't forget this sight. Some faces hardened with scorn, others flickered with a grudging respect. Whatever the feeling, all knew they had witnessed something rare. A silent man nodding to the bold words of a black woman in the middle of Main Street. Jonas stepped forward, closing the space between them. He offered no hand, no honeyed words, only stood beside her. The distance was gone. To the onlookers, that alone was answer enough. Two figures, one tall, quiet, weathered, the other calm, steady, unbowed, stood side by side in the dust of Red Creek. No clasped hands, no fine vows, but the very sight of them together marked a beginning. The crowd began to scatter. Some hurried home to retell it. Some ducked into the saloon to spin the tale brighter. Some old-timers muttered darkly of ill omens. But most knew Red Creek had just been given something new to talk about for weeks, maybe months to come. Jonas did not look at their faces. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, though he felt Lydia's presence close by. In his chest he heard Matthew's ghost of a promise, but with it came something new, something unnamed, stirred by a single nod. Lydia, too, kept her gaze forward. She walked at his side, her chin lifted. She had set her condition. He had met it. For her, that was enough. The noon sun still burned, the dust still swirled. Yet the street of Red Creek had witnessed a scene that would ripple for years. A stranger, dark-skinned, declaring her terms in broad daylight, and a silent man, nodding his acceptance before every eye. They stood together, wordless, yet all of Red Creek understood. A story had just begun. 2 weeks earlier, the Montana sky had swallowed the light like a gaping mouth. For 3 days and 3 nights the blizzard raged, wind howling like wild beasts across the whitewashed prairie. The Kincaid cattle camp had turned into a labyrinth of shuddering tents, ropes straining, canvas sheets crusted in ice, every gust beating down like the lash of a whip. Inside one hastily pitched canvas shelter, the dim flicker of an oil lamp could not drive away the cold that sank into the bone. On a blanket soaked with fevered sweat, Matthew Kincaid lay gasping. His breath rattled, broken, his narrow chest heaving with effort. Fits of coughing wrung the last strength from him, leaving his face pallid, shadowed by death's approach. Jonas Hale sat close, his broad frame cramped in the narrow space, rough hands awkward yet steady as he pressed the blanket tighter around his friend. He was a man long used to the smells of smoke, horseflesh, and wet hide, but the sour scent of fever and faltering breath pressed a weight into his throat he could hardly bear. Matthew stirred, his voice a rasp. "Jonas!" Jonas bent low, straining to catch each word over the wind thrashing the canvas. You must. Promise me. When she comes to Red Creek, Lydia will find you. Don't leave her alone. That name, Lydia, Jonas heard for the first time. He could not shape her face in his mind, but in Matthew's dimming eyes, he saw something fierce, something unyielding, like steel flashing against the storm. Marry her, promise me. Jonas clenched his jaw. Marriage had never been part of his life's trail. His years were measured in cattle drives, in seasons of spring grass and killing winters, not in hearth fires or lamplight waiting at home. Yet memory cut deep. Matthew at 15, plunging into a spring flood to drag a half-drowned Jonas to shore. Both had shivered, laughing like fools on the riverbank. But from that moment, Jonas owed him a life. Now that debt had returned, demanded in the heart of a blizzard. Matthew's trembling hand fumbled, then pressed something into Jonas's palm, a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Jonas looked down, a handkerchief stitched with the letter M in blue thread, a half-folded letter, a few small keepsakes, little things, yet the remnants of a whole life. Give them to her, Matthew whispered, tears blurring his eyes, and marry her. Keep your word for me. Jonas swallowed hard. He was not a man of empty talk. To him, a promise weighed like stone, spoken once, carried always. But this was a chain that could bind a lifetime. He knew it. He nodded, not out of want, out of debt. Leaning close, his voice was low, grave. I'll do it. The words fell heavy, like a vow carved in rock. Outside, the storm wailed like mourning. Inside, the lamplight cast hollows across Matthew's wasted face, shadows carved deep. His eyes drifted shut, at peace at last. Jonas sat rigid, back locked. In his mind, he saw the shape of a woman he had never met. Lydia Harper. The woman who had written Matthew letters, who had staked her hope on a future in this hard land. And now, she would step into his life, not by love, but by a vow born in the storm. That evening, when the storm outside had eased just enough to let the canvas rest, Jonas sat alone in the corner of the tent, Matthew's small bundle laid before him. The oil lamp sputtered, its flame trembling, wax running in uneven trails down the scarred brass. He had put it off for hours, but at last he knew he had to open it. Whatever lay inside would be the only legacy of his friend, and with it, the burden Jonas had just agreed to bear. The bundle was wrapped in oiled cloth, tied with an old strip of leather. When Jonas loosened the knot, the smell of dried grass and stale sweat rose up, stirring memories of endless trails. Inside lay a handkerchief stitched with the letter M in blue thread, and a folded letter. Matthew's handwriting still visible, though blurred by water. Jonas opened it with care. The first lines were steady, the hand strong and sure. Lydia, if I do not return. And then nothing. No more words. The pen had stopped mid-thought, the ink bleeding into a dark blot like a wound that never closed. Jonas sat in silence, his rough finger resting on the paper. He read it again and again, as if his eyes might somehow drag hidden words from the page. But there were none. The letter would never be finished. In the cramped tent, the wind rattled the canvas, but Jonas heard only the heavy beat of his own heart. If I do not return. The phrase hung there, endless, like the mouth of a deep canyon. What had Matthew meant to write for Lydia? Words of love? An apology? Some truth he had never spoken? Jonas shut his eyes, leaning his head against the wooden post. Memory rose, the face of a younger Matthew, grinning after hauling him from the flood years ago. Matthew had never been a man to leave things undone. His letters home, his tallies for the cattle, always clear, precise, complete. Yet now, in the hour that mattered most, he had left a void. Jonas folded the letter, tucking it into his coat pocket. But the silence of that paper was not silent at all. It whispered to him through the night. He imagined Lydia, the woman he had never met, the one Matthew had spoken of in his fevered whisper. How would she receive this letter if he placed it in her hands? She would see the broken line, the unfinished thought, and turn to Jonas. Would she ask him to fill the silence? Would she expect him to give voice to words her Matthew never had the chance to write? Outside, the storm wailed on. Inside, the lamplight swung and dipped. Jonas lifted the handkerchief, running it through his fingers, the neat blue stitches catching the glow. He did not know if Lydia's hand had sewn it, or another's, but looking at it brought Matthew's face back to him. Not pale and burning with fever, but calm, younger, whole. Jonas let out a long breath. He had never feared carrying weight. He was used to driving herds across the plains, to meeting storms head-on. But this small bundle pressed heavier than any burden he had known. He wrapped it again, tied it firm, set it beside him as though to remind himself, this was not just relic, but tether. A thread binding him to a woman still unknown, whose name was now carved into the course of his life. That night he could not sleep. Each time his eyes closed, the broken line came back. If I do not return. A thought left unfinished, yet enough to bind two strangers together. And deep within, Jonas knew the truth. What he feared most was not the storm outside, but the look in her eyes when she read it. The next morning, Red Creek lay under a chill. The weak spring sun spilled across wooden roofs, glinting off the last patches of snow clinging from winter's storm. The town woke to its familiar rhythm, the hammer striking in the smithy, horses calling from the pens, shop doors creaking open. But inside the small pine chapel at the town's edge, the air was different, still, solemn, edged with curiosity. The chapel had been built by the townsfolk's own hands, plain, without grandeur, no bell to toll. Rough timber walls, a wooden cross on the altar, and a vase of wildflowers left to wilt from the week before. The pews stood in 2 rows, most of them empty. Only a few had gathered. Mrs. Dobbins from the bakery, old Mr. Murphy from the general store, 2 young cowhands who worked for Jonas, and Reverend Thompson, his hair silvered with age. Jonas Hale entered first. Tall, broad-shouldered, his white shirt pressed cleaner than usual beneath an old black vest. He set his hat on the front pew and sat waiting. His gaze did not linger on the sparse gathering, but on the chapel door, half open, where Lydia would appear. And then she came. Lydia Harper stepped inside, her stride straight and sure. Her dark blue-green dress was worn but neatly pressed. On her head, only a small, modest hat, no veil, no bouquet. She walked the short aisle with steady pace, her brown eyes not glancing around, but fixed on Jonas. There was no fluster, no shy lowering of lashes, only a strange calm that held. The witnesses watched in silence, some with narrowed eyes, some whispering behind sleeves. They still could not grow used to the thought that a black woman would become the wife of Jonas Hale, the man the town respected for his command and quiet authority. And yet, none could deny she carried herself in a way that demanded regard. Reverend Thompson's voice rose, slow and warm. "We are gathered here, before the sight of God, to unite these two in covenant." His words filled the wooden space. No music, no choir, only silence pressing close. Jonas rose, turning to face Lydia. She stood with straight shoulders, hands folded before her. "Jonas Hale," the Reverend said, "do you vow to keep your word, to uphold and respect this woman in days of ease and in days of trial?" Jonas held Lydia's gaze. In her eyes he found steadiness, almost a dare that he should not falter. His throat was dry, but his voice came low, sure. "I do." "Lydia Harper, do you vow to walk beside this man, to share and to keep respect, in light as well as in darkness?" Lydia drew a breath, her answer clear. "I do." No hesitation, no tremor. The Reverend smiled faintly, lifting his hand in blessing. "Then by holy covenant, I declare you husband and wife." In that moment, there should have been a kiss. But there was none. Instead, Lydia and Jonas reached for each other's hands. His, broad and calloused. Hers, smaller, sun-browned. Their grip was firm, binding. It was no promise of tender romance, but of something harder, more real, a public pledge of duty. Some in the pews nodded. Others exchanged puzzled glances. Mrs. Dobbins whispered, "At least they are honest." Mr. Murphy only shrugged, his thoughts unreadable. The two young cowhands kept quiet, knowing Jonas would brook no laughter. Lydia released his hand, dipped her head respectfully toward the Reverend. No tears, no smile, only the calm of a woman who had long prepared herself for this day. Jonas, too, showed nothing beyond silence. When the ceremony ended, they signed their names in the book. Ink pressed heavy into the page. Jonas's bold, straight, Lydia's neat, simple. Two names now joined by one line. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and the first green shoots of grass. Jonas stepped down the chapel's wooden steps, Lydia beside him. They did not hold hands, did not speak. Yet every eye watching knew a marriage had been made. No one saw the weight tighten in Jonas's chest. He remembered the bundle still tucked in his coat, the handkerchief marked with M, the letter left unfinished. He reminded himself. Today he had not only married Lydia Harper, he had upheld a dying man's vow. And Lydia, passing through the chapel doorway beneath the town's gaze, felt no fear. Instead, she held to her pride. She had stood, head high, and entered this bond not by pity, but by her own choice, the choice to keep her dignity. They left the chapel together, walking toward the dusty street. No bells, no flowers, no handfuls of rice. Only sun, wind, and the town's silent eyes. A beginning without romance, born of duty. And yet, in that stark emptiness, a seed had been planted. The Kowalski boarding house sat at the far end of Red Creek, beside a brook just beginning to break free of ice. A two-story frame of gray pine, its heavy roof shouldered the seasons. Smoke curling from the chimney lent it more warmth than its weather-worn boards suggested. Travelers passing through the town often chose it for shelter. Mrs. Kowalski was known for her kindness. her cooking rich with spices from her old country, and for rooms kept tidy and clean. Jonas and Lydia moved into the largest room upstairs, the one folks jokingly called the honeymoon chamber, for many couples had spent a few weeks there before finding a place of their own. The room held a broad bed with coarse sheets, a small table by the window overlooking Main Street, and a single old chair in the corner. The faint scent of pine resin lingered in the air, mingling with the smell of oatmeal porridge and bread baking below. When Jonas set his leather bag on the plank floor, Lydia stood at the center, her eyes sweeping the space. She showed no unease, no awkwardness, only turned, her voice calm yet resolute. "I did not come here to be kept. I need work." The words cut through the stillness like the edge of a thin blade. Jonas lifted his gaze, meeting the depth of her brown eyes. There was no request in them, no plea, only a statement, plain as stone. He did not answer at once. He pulled off his gloves, hung his coat on the peg, every motion deliberate, steady. At last he gave his habitual nod, small, certain, enough to say he had heard and accepted. "All right," was all he said. Lydia tilted her head as if to be sure, but when his face held, she asked no more. She knew his silence was agreement. The days that followed passed like two lines running close yet never crossing. Each morning Jonas rode out to the hail spread, tending cattle with his hands and the younger riders. Lydia walked the town in quiet search. She asked at Murphy's store, at Mrs. Dobbin's bakery, at the chapel. The answers came the same. In Red Creek, no one had work for a black woman, save odd tasks too meager to sustain her. Yet Lydia did not falter. She counted her coins, little enough, just enough to rent a narrow room if she stretched it thin. She watched the ragged shirts on children, the coarse seams in miners' coats, and knew she could do better. One evening, in their lamp-lit room, Lydia sat on the bed's edge, her hands busy stitching a torn shirt Mrs. Kowalski had given her. Her fingers drove the needle in clean, straight lines, each stitch strong. Jonas sat at the table, sharpening his hunting knife in silence. The glow painted them both, an unfamiliar quiet, not heavy yet not warm. Lydia looked up, speaking low. "If I could rent a little place, I'd open a sewing shop. Folks here all need thread and needle." Jonas paused his blade. He said nothing at first, only glanced at the neat rows of stitches, straighter, sturdier, finer than any store-bought shirt. He gave one nod. "Try it," was all he said. The next day, Lydia found a narrow room beside Murphy's store. A dusty window, a floor of split planks, walls stained with age. Murphy named a price higher than she could meet. She turned away, heavy but without showing it. That night, when Lydia slept, Jonas walked to the general store. He set half the rent in silver on the counter, his eyes hard on Murphy. "Keep this quiet. Let her believe she managed on her own." Murphy nodded, the hint of a smile tugging his mouth. "You married yourself a strong one. Best let her think so. It'll serve her well." Jonas said nothing, only tipped his hat and left. He wanted no thanks, no debt. He wanted only for her to have the chance to prove herself. A few days later, Lydia placed the key in her hand, her face alight with quiet triumph, as if she alone had wrestled fortune into her grasp. Jonas said nothing, but in her eyes he saw a new spark, the look of a woman stepping into life on her own feet, not by pity. That evening, when Jonas returned, Lydia was arranging a few rolls of cloth and small tins of thread upon the table. She smiled, softly, the first he had seen since the day she arrived. Not radiant, not boastful, but enough to brighten the room. Jonas stood, looking only a moment, then hung his coat in silence. Yet within, something strange took root, fragile as a seed in thawing ground. A promise he had carried for another was slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to change its shape. The narrow room beside Murphy's store was no larger than half the Kowalski kitchen, yet to Lydia it felt like a sky opened wide. The warped wooden door groaned each time she pushed it. The floorboards split to show thin cracks, and the window lay beneath a thick coat of dust. But when she stepped inside, the morning light streamed through the glass, spilling across the worn walls, and in that pale glow she saw not decay, but a place where life might begin anew. On the first day, Lydia swept the dust clear, scrubbed the glass until it gleamed, then knelt to brush the floorboards until the sharp tang of pine resin filled the room. A borrowed table was set near the window, a plain wooden chair beside it, spools of thread and scissors neatly arranged. She hung a square of white cloth against the wall, her silent signboard. No words, no ornament. Yet all who passed would know there was a new seamstress in Red Creek. Word spread quickly, as it always did, without need of notice, but not all were ready to step inside. For many in Red Creek, handing their garments to a black woman was no easy thing. Prejudice clung like dust, settled into every glance, every whisper. The first days, Lydia sat by the window with needle in hand, her posture steady, her eyes calm. But the door stayed quiet. At times a figure would pause, glance in, hesitate, then move on. Each moment of doubt stung like a hidden pin, yet Lydia did not show it. She kept her back straight, her hands working, the steady pull of thread her quiet defiance. And then someone came. A middle-aged man with a shirt torn along the sleeve stepped through. He lingered long, eyes weighing her against his own need, torn between custom and necessity. At last he laid the shirt on her table, his voice rough. "Can you mend it?" Lydia only nodded. Her hands moved with certainty, the needle driving neat and strong, the white thread straight as rail across the tear. When he returned the next evening, the shirt lay mended so cleanly the rip could hardly be found. He picked it up, silent for a long while, then laid a few coins on the table. He said no thanks, but when he walked out, his eyes held less suspicion. The following day, Lydia saw a young mother pass with a child on her hip, her dress torn at the hem. Lydia stepped out, thread and needle in hand, offering softly, "If you'd like, I can mend it." The woman flushed, uncertain, but did not refuse. She left the dress. When she returned the next day, her eyes lit with quiet delight. Another customer had returned. So the days moved. The shop was not busy, yet it was no longer empty. Some who once glanced with scorn now lingered, considering. A few worn coats and trousers found their way to her table. Children sometimes wandered in, wide-eyed at the bright spools of thread. Lydia answered their questions with patience, her rare smile breaking through like dawn. Jonas, riding back from the range, passed often. He never entered, only looked, through the small window. He saw her seated, back straight, her eyes fixed on each stitch, her fingers quick and steady. In the evenings the lamplight spilled across her, her shadow bending over the cloth, small but unyielding. Something in Jonas shifted. He had thought this marriage was duty alone, But watching Lydia hold to her words, "I need work," he saw she did not need his rescue. She needed recognition, and that stirred a quiet respect in him. Each night when Lydia returned to the boarding house, her hands carried the faint scent of thread, her dress dusted with fabric shavings. She did not boast, nor sigh. She simply folded cloth, sometimes stitched another seam, sometimes just tucked away scraps. Yet in her eyes, a steady light grew, and the town began to murmur differently. Her stitches hold. Better than new, some say. Perhaps worth trying once. Bit by bit, Lydia carved her place, not by pleading, but by work. Jonas heard it at the saloon, in Murphy's store. He did not join in, only listened, silent. But he knew. Lydia was opening her own door, without his hand. One night, with the spring wind drifting through town, Jonas passed her shop long after it had closed. He stopped, watching the dim flame still flickering inside. There was Lydia, bent over her table, needle flashing through a last patch of cloth. He lingered longer than he meant to, and when at last he walked away, there was a spark within him, faint, nameless, but alive. That morning, Red Creek stirred louder than usual. The weekend market drew folks in from the outlying ranches, spilling onto Main Street. Stalls were laden with pickled vegetables, pelts, flour, cornmeal, jugs of corn whiskey. Bargaining voices tangled with the rattle of wagon wheels, while dust and the sharp tang of smoke drifted together in the air. Lydia's little sewing shop, set right beside Murphy's store, stood square in the path of every glance. The wooden door sat half open, her figure moving steady behind the thin curtain in the window. Passers-by slowed, some sneering, some curious. By mid-morning, heavy steps crossed her threshold. A woman entered, Charlotte Alden, wife of one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county. Her dress was silk trimmed with lace, her face powdered pale. In Red Creek, she was known for the way she looked down on anyone she considered beneath her. She dropped a wool coat onto the table, her voice sharp. "The hem is torn. Mend it. I'll be back next week." Lydia gave a slight nod, took the garment. Her eyes passed over the rip. It would take skill, but not long. That very day she set needle to cloth, her stitches straight and firm until the tear vanished like it had never been. A week later, Charlotte returned. The shop had a few inside already waiting, a young woman holding a child, a cowboy with a torn shirt in hand. Lydia laid the coat on the table, neat as new. Charlotte glanced at it, lips curling. "Acceptable." She pulled coins from her purse and dropped them with a clink. Lydia saw at once. The payment was short by nearly half. The room hushed. Those waiting looked on, knowing this was more than wages. It was a test. Lydia straightened, her voice clear though calm. "The payment is not enough, Mrs. Alden." A ripple ran through the room. Charlotte lifted her chin, eyes cold. "You are new here. This is what I give you, and you should be grateful for the work." Her words tightened faces, drew frowns, but Lydia did not bend. She folded the coat, laid it back on the table before Charlotte. "Without full pay, I cannot accept." The moment struck sharp, steel on stone. The air stretched taut. Charlotte flushed, stunned. She had expected Lydia to bow, for the weight of prejudice and wealth to settle the matter. But Lydia held her ground, calm, eyes steady, unyielding. Whispers stirred. The cowboy smirked. The young mother's eyes widened with respect. With trembling hand, Charlotte flung down the rest of the coins, silver scattering across the floor. She snatched up the coat and stormed out, silk skirts sweeping dust, heels hammering the wood like a judge's gavel. When the door slammed shut, the shop seemed to breathe again. Lydia's face did not change. She stooped, gathered the coin, set it in the box, and returned to her stitching, the needle finding its rhythm once more. By sundown, the tale had spread. At the saloon, the smithy, Murphy's store, everywhere they spoke it. The colored woman refused Alden's wife right there in the shop. Some shook their heads. Foolish pride, she won't last. But others nodded slow. Strong. At least she's got her self-respect. Jonas heard it in the stables. A cowhand recounted the story with a laugh. But Jonas's face only grew still, neither smiling nor frowning. That evening he passed by the shop. Through the window's glow he saw Lydia bent over her work, her hands steady, as if nothing had happened at all. The lamplight caught her form, quiet, composed, as though such defiance was as natural to her as breath. Jonas lingered in the street, watching. Inside him, respect took deeper root. He knew many might pity Lydia, many might scorn her, but few could stand before the town and hold their dignity unshaken. The next day, the shop was busier. A handful of new customers arrived, laying down worn garments without comment. They spoke no word of Mrs. Alden, but their eyes carried trust. Lydia received the clothes in silence, letting her work speak. For her, it was no victory to boast of. It was the only choice, to keep her self-respect or lose everything. And in Red Creek, where dust swallowed the weak, Lydia knew she could stand only on her own hands. As the long days of spring shortened and night came sooner, lamplight became the flame that warmed Red Creek. Along Main Street, a few wooden houses glowed dimly, but none shone with the steady, welcoming light of Lydia Harper's little sewing room. By day, her shop worked as always. Customers brought shirts torn at the elbow, skirts ripped at the hem from fences. Lydia stitched in silence, each thread another step claiming her place in the town. But when dusk fell, the shop became something else. Young women began to come, daughters of farmers, girls working in the houses of the wealthy. At first they arrived timidly, in twos or threes, fearful of being seen and mocked. But once inside, finding Lydia waiting with her calm eyes and rare, warm smile, their shoulders eased. On the wooden table lay spools of thread, scraps of cloth, and needles. Lydia showed them patiently how to thread, how to hold steady, how to stitch without puckering the fabric. Their fingers fumbled, needles bent crooked, thread snarled. Lydia never scolded. She only touched their hands lightly, her voice low but firm. This is not just sewing a shirt. It is learning to stand on your own feet. A mended garment is more than cloth. It is your dignity, so you need not bow your head to anyone. Eyes lifted at those words, the lamplight catching quiet tears and quiet resolve. Some nodded, some pressed lips tight, hiding their own bruised stories. Yet all listened and tried again. So the shop filled each evening with whispers and soft laughter. The girls spoke of families, of parents eager to marry them off, of small hopes, like a new pair of shoes. Lydia did not chatter. She listened, nodding at times, offering a brief word, then guiding their clumsy stitches with patience. The oil lamp burned steady, casting their shadows long upon the wall. Lydia's tall and straight, the younger girls leaning close beside her. It was something like a small household, a rare refuge for women in this harsh land. Outside, Red Creek at night was sparse. The saloon still blazed, a banjo twanged, cowhands laughed loud. Yet when Jonas Hale walked by, it was not the saloon he heard, but the ripple of quiet laughter drifting from Lydia's shop. He stopped, standing in the dark across the street. Through the window he saw her, bent slightly over the table, guiding a girl's awkward fingers. The lamp touched her bound hair, lit her steady brown eyes. Lydia was no woman for the town's dances, no one for silk or ribbons. But here, in this small space, she shone with a light all her own, a light others leaned toward. Jonas stood watching. Inside, something shifted again. At first, he had married Lydia for duty, for Matthew's dying wish. Then he had thought his role was to guard her from harm. But now, seeing her teach others to rise on their own feet, Jonas knew it was she who held a strength he had never known. His burden was turning into respect. He remembered her words in the street. "If you mean to marry me out of pity, then right here I refuse." That day he had nodded almost by reflex. Now he understood. It was not only meant for him. It was for the whole town, a place accustomed to women's silence. Lydia had claimed her dignity, and in doing so planted seeds in others. A wind stirred, dust skimming down the street. Jonas tugged his hat low and walked on, unwilling for anyone to see how long he had lingered. Yet in his chest, respect had taken root, firm as oak, something more than pity, though still unnamed. Inside, Lydia glanced up, sensing a shadow at the window. But when she looked, only night and dust remained. She turned back to the girls, her voice calm. "The stitch isn't even yet. Be patient. You'll get it right." And the lamplight burned on, bright upon every face, each stitch stretching forward like a thread of hope, fragile yet enduring. That day, Red Creek woke to a busier morning than most. The weekly market had ended, but townsfolk lingered on Main Street, trading talk of planting season and the long-awaited rains. Lydia opened her sewing shop early, the hinges creaking as the spring wind swept in, carrying dust and the scent of young grass. She set out her threads and cloth as usual, her face calm, though well accustomed to the steady gaze of those who looked at her with judgment. Near midday, as the street grew crowded, a new figure appeared, a tall man on horseback, shoulders broad, his clean-cut clothes setting him apart from the dust-stained cowhands. He dismounted before Murphy's store, tugged off his gloves, and cast his eyes about. It wasn't long before the whispers spread. Caleb Hale, Jonas's cousin, long settled in Helena, had come to Red Creek. Among the Hales, Caleb was known for his pride. Family name was his gospel. When he caught sight of Jonas walking up from the ranch yard, he wasted no time. He strode through the throng, his voice carrying, "Jonas Hale!" The market hushed, folks pausing as though waiting for a show. Jonas stopped, his hat brim low, his eyes darkening at the sight of Caleb. Caleb didn't circle his words. He thrust a finger toward Lydia's shop, his voice sharp. "I heard it, but I could scarce believe. You, a Hale, married a colored woman. Do you know the shame you drag upon this family?" The air froze. All around, eyes shifted, some to Jonas, some to Lydia, who stood in her doorway, hands tightening at her dress. She hadn't meant to step forward, but Caleb's words struck her like a lash. Caleb pressed on, face reddening. "All Montana will laugh at us. A Hale bringing that into the family. What would grandfather say? Were he alive? You've betrayed your own blood, Jonas." Jonas stood silent. He was a man used to holding his tongue, to stepping aside from conflict. But here, before the crowd, beneath Lydia's gaze, silence was no shield. It was surrender. Something in his chest clenched tight. He remembered the nights passing her shop, her figure bent to the lamp, teaching girls to stitch with steady patience. He remembered her facing Charlotte Alden, unbowed. He remembered her hand signing the marriage book without tremor. Heat rose in him, breaking through the armor of quiet he had worn all his life. Jonas straightened, lifted his hat from his head, and his voice rang out like thunder. "That's enough, Caleb." The crowd held its breath. Few had ever heard Jonas Hale raise his voice. He stepped forward, his eyes hard, his words carved clean. "She is my wife." The sound struck like a hammer blow, clear, unshakable, leaving no room for doubt. Murmurs swept through the street. Some nodded, others frowned, but all knew Jonas had chosen his side. Caleb gaped as if struck. His mouth opened to retort, but Jonas's gaze, solid as stone, stole the words from him. Jonas was no man of arguments, but when he fixed his course, none could move him. "She bears the Hale name as I do," Jonas said, slow and steady, "and any who insult her, insult me." Silence spread heavy. The wind kicked dust into the air, swirling across the gap between them. Caleb's face purpled with rage. He swung back toward his horse, his words bitter. "You'll regret this, Jonas." The horse snorted, hooves striking up a cloud as he galloped away, leaving only the hush behind. Jonas stood in the street, hat in hand. People still watched, but no one spoke. A few tipped their heads in quiet respect. A few offered faint smiles. At the doorway, Lydia stood still, her heart clenched not in pain, but in astonishment. Since coming to Red Creek, she had grown used to whispers, to cold eyes. She had taught herself not to let them reach her. But this was the first time someone had stood before all to say only, "She is my wife." When Jonas turned, their eyes met. She said nothing, but her gaze shone, deep and wet, like a river breaking free inside her. Jonas gave a single nod, as if to say it was not to prove anything, but simply because it was true. And in Lydia's heart, something long held silent stirred. For the first time since Matthew's death, she no longer felt herself standing alone against the wind of prejudice. There was a shoulder beside hers now, strong and unshaken. And that, more than anything, left her breathless. Winter fell upon Red Creek like a heavy quilt, thick and unyielding. Snow drifted without pause, covering rooftops, piling high along the street edges. Wind cut through the valley, slipping into every crack of every door, making the town huddle inward. Men wrapped scarves tight, boots crunching fast over ice. Children no longer played in the street, their tracks soon buried under fresh white. Through those long winter days, Lydia's little shop still glowed. Behind fogged glass, she could be seen at her table, needle in hand, lamplight soft against her steady face. Yet that night, as Jonas led his horse down the street, he saw something different. Lydia was mending a small coat, so ragged most would have cast it aside. Fabric worn through at the elbows, buttons gone, seams unraveling. But she worked patiently, stitch by stitch, replacing buttons, her brown eyes bright in the lamplight, not once complaining. When she finished, she folded the coat, wrapped it in old brown paper, and drew on her cloak. Jonas, pulled by something unseen, followed at a distance. He watched as Lydia stopped at a weathered cabin on the edge of town, the home of a child he had seen wandering in a thin shirt. She set the parcel at the door, knocked softly 3 times, then slipped back into the dark before it opened. The child's face appeared, wide-eyed, as small hands unwrapped the bundle. When he lifted the coat, his eyes lit with a fire against the night cold. Jonas, hidden in shadow, felt his chest tighten. He knew Lydia sought no witness, no thanks. Her act was not for praise. It was born of her belief that no one should shiver in the wind for lack of means. Later that night, when she returned to the boarding house, Jonas waited by the fire. The narrow wooden room was warmer than usual, the hearth crackling low. He watched her hang her cloak, wash her hands, sit across from him, cheeks flushed from the cold, a strand of hair fallen loose across her face. Jonas's gaze held her, and at last he spoke, his voice rough, firm. That promise, it's no burden anymore. Lydia lifted her eyes, waiting. Now it's what I want. Silence filled the room. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks. The fire popped softly in the stove. In that stillness, Lydia saw in his eyes no shadow of duty, no ghost of Matthew, only something true, steady. She hesitated, then answered, quiet but sure. So do I. But let it be built on respect, not pity. Jonas nodded, slow, as though swearing before himself. No more words were needed. He rose, walked around the table. Lydia stayed, unflinching, her brown eyes wide with both surprise and trust. He bent, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, pausing, waiting for her consent. She did not speak, but she lifted her face, closing the space. The first kiss came, slow, sincere. Not fierce, not hurried, but like a new covenant. One born not of obligation, but of choice. Outside, snow fell thick, burying the day's old tracks. But in that small room, fire met fire. Jonas's arm wrapped gently around her, feeling her breath tremble, warm. For the first time since their wedding day, the invisible distance between them was gone. When they parted, Lydia smiled, not bright, but enough to light the room. Jonas whispered low, for her alone, "We'll build from here." She nodded, her eyes shining with a tenderness he had never seen. And in that moment, they both knew. What had begun as duty had become something real, an affection strong enough to carry them through Red Creek's hardest winters. Spring came late to Red Creek, but with a warmth that lingered. As the last drifts pulled back from the creek banks, the town turned green with new growth. To the north of town, on a stretch of land swept by cool mountain wind, Jonas and Lydia had purchased a wide parcel. The soil there was thin, too poor for grain, but it was fit for flax. Slender plants yielding strong fibers, spun into cloth. Standing on that ground, Lydia tucked loose strands beneath her bonnet, her gaze fixed on the horizon. What she saw was not only a field of pale blossoms, but bolts of linen stretched across looms, shirts and dresses cut from them, tablecloths spread in homes, and most of all, opportunity. For the women of Red Creek, whose hands had always known only broom and washtub, now given needle and scissors to fashion worth from their own labor. Jonas stood beside her, a hoe across his shoulder, sweat darkening his brow, though a rare smile played faint on his lips. He had never thought his life would touch thread or cloth. But since the day Lydia stepped down from that coach beneath the town's stairs, his thinking had shifted. Now he knew this land was not his alone, but hers too, for what she meant to build. While Jonas and the cowhands worked the field, Lydia kept the shop alive. Yet it was no longer only a place of mending. She opened her table to teach other women. At first, just the girls who had come in evenings, then wives and mothers followed. Some nights the room was crowded, cloth spread across the table, the click of needles mingling with laughter and low voices. Many of them had once scorned her. Now they sat at her side, learning each stitch. Some paid with coins, others with milk or wood, but Lydia turned none away. What mattered was that they left with skill, something to hold to when hardship came. Once a young widow struggled with clumsy hands, her eyes rimmed red. Her husband had died in the mines, leaving 3 small children. Lydia guided her fingers, steadying the line of thread, her voice soft. "We will not fall so long as we have our hands." The room hushed. Then the needles moved again, slow, determined. Each evening, Jonas passed by returning from the range. Through the window he saw Lydia among the women, her eyes alight, her smile gentle. And he realized the promise that began as duty had become not only his choice, but his pride. So too the town began to change. The whispers of scorn faded, replaced by quiet acknowledgement. More garments came to her shop. More asked to buy her cloth. Some even sought her needle for church dresses. No one spoke it plain, but their eyes told it. Suspicion had become respect. One late winter night, snow falling thick outside, Jonas sat in their cabin. Wind moaned at the eaves, but fire glowed red in the hearth. Lydia sat at the table, mending a child's dress, the lamplight soft on her calm face. Jonas stepped forward and laid a worn bundle before her. Lydia set aside her needle, unfolded it. Inside was the handkerchief with the stitched M, the blue thread frayed but still clear. "Matthews," she whispered, her eyes lifting to his. He nodded. "I want you to keep it." Her fingers trembled as she touched the cloth. Then she found a seam, oddly thick. She worked the stitches loose and a folded scrap of paper fell free. On it, just a few words, hurried and rough, yet clear enough to read. "Jonas will keep his word. Trust him." The room fell silent. Lydia held it in her hand, her heart swelling. In his last days, Matthew must have written this, not only to bind her to Jonas, but to leave behind trust, like a lantern burning in the dark. Tears filled her eyes, yet she did not sob. She only nodded, as though speaking to her lost friend. "I believe." Jonas sat across, his gaze deep as the night. He did not speak, but within, he felt the bond between 3 lives, one gone, 2 remaining, finally sealed by that short line of ink. Outside, snow fell, blanketing the town in white. Inside, fire flickered, warmth spread. Jonas reached for her hand, and this time no distance remained. They were no longer strangers bound by duty. They were husband and wife, anchored together on this harsh land. From a vow born in a snowstorm, a home had risen, not of pity, but of respect, and of quiet, steadfast love. Perhaps in life the strongest thing is not grand words, but the one who silently keeps them to the end. Jonas and Lydia, once strangers tied by obligation, had found in each other respect, and from it, true affection. They needed no gilded vows, only hands clasped when the wind howled beyond their door, and their tale, in Red Creek of long ago, is it not a reminder to us still that love need not begin in fire, but may grow slow, in patience, in truth, in trust? Have you known such a love, arriving late yet holding fast? Have you ever kept a promise so long, only to find it had carried you too? If this story warms your heart, leave a comment, share your memory, and don't forget to like and subscribe, so each week we can sit together once more, listening to these Wild West love stories, gentle stories, for hearts that still know how to stir at any age.